Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club program. My name's Rachel Becker. I'm an environment reporter at CalMatters and your moderator today. As the club continues to host virtual events, they are grateful for the continued support of their members and donors. Visit www.commonwealthclub.org to learn more about membership or support the club right now with a tax-deductible gift by clicking the blue donate button on your screen. The club would also like to thank Wonderfest for supporting today's program. Just a reminder, if you have a question for today's guest, please submit those in the chat. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome Carl Zimmer, the weekly Matter columnist for the New York Times and author of Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Carl is a deeply respected science journalist and has won numerous awards, including the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Science Journalism Award. It's a mouthful, 3 times. He also teaches at Yale, where he's a professor adjunct in the Department of Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry. So Carl, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So let me start off by asking you, you've written more than a dozen other books about viruses, parasites, neuroscience, genetics, evolution. What made you ask the central question of your new book, What is Life?
I guess in a way, it's just sort of lurking there in the background the whole time that I've been writing other books about life and writing for the New York Times. You know, I'm writing about these things that are alive, like trees and jellyfish and all sorts of other cool things. And, you know, the question keeps coming up, well, what unites them? What is it that they all are? What does it mean to be alive, as in the subtitle of the book? And, you know, it's the kind of question I would sort of delve into from time to time in articles over the years. And I just thought, you know, maybe this is something that I should really go deep into with an entire book. And so that was sort of the genesis of Life's Edge. And I thought, you know, maybe I should think about this, you know, not necessarily as like providing the definitive answer, but going on a trip with the readers through life, starting kind of at the core of life with things that we all agree are alive, and then going into that weird, fuzzy borderland where life and non-life meet, and trying to figure out, well, where do we draw that line between the living and the non-living?
And as we sort of take that trip through this book over and over, we see scientists try and, spoiler alert, ultimately fail to come up with big sweeping theories of life or even really discover its essence. Which of the stories that you came across has really stuck with you?
Oh, there are many. That's the amazing thing, is that there are so many stories over the course of the past, say, 300 years, where you have scientists who, in one way or another, are confronting this basic question of what life is, and are sometimes going off in some pretty wild directions and chasing mirages. Sometimes, you know, this is a book about failure, but in the best sense of the word. You know, we haven't really reckoned with what life is yet, and it'll take a while. And so you have, for example, in the 1800s, mid 1800s, a lot of really prominent naturalists, some of the world's greatest naturalists, who became convinced that the entire ocean floor was covered with one living thing. They would call it a living paste. And they thought it was the most fundamental feature of life on Earth. And they even gave it a Latin name, Bathybius. It was in textbooks. Everyone thought that this was a real thing, that maybe this was the source of all life as we know it. And it didn't exist. It was just the result of a fluke of bad chemistry when someone was preserving some ooze on the seafloor. But, you know, the question of what it takes to be alive is so tricky that even the greatest minds can get fooled and see mirages where none exists. So those are the kinds of stories that really fascinated me. And, there's sort of, I think, scientists today should take some comfort from them that really great minds could get fooled.
Yeah, something I wondered when I was reading about Bathybius and how it was just an accident of chemistry was what that tells us about this search for what it means to be alive. Does it mean that it's fruitless?
No, not at all. It means that it's kind of a bumpy road. One reason that that this idea of Bathybius was so embraced and was reported on in newspapers. Everyone thought this was real. The reason for it in part was that this was at the time where scientists were finally able to see inside of cells. And they finally realized that there was this strange gooey substance in there that they called protoplasm. And it started to become clear that whatever it is that makes life special, the answer was going to be found in that goo, in that protoplasm. And so when scientists would look through their microscopes and think they saw this sort of very primitive cell-like thing, they might say, well, this is it. This is the Germans in the early 1800s almost predicted this. They said that the first form of life was what they called an slime, the proto slime. And so people thought, well, here it is. We found it. So it all kind of fit together until some good chemists said, wait a minute, like we're looking for it and we're not finding it. And I think somebody made a big mistake. And to the credit of these scientists who had been promoting it, like Huxley, for example, perhaps the greatest biologist of his time, he got a letter from a scientific voyage where these scientists were saying, like, we don't think this is real. And he immediately published the letter in Nature, and just said, if there's a mistake, it's my fault. So he owned to it. And so science moved forward. So Bathybius doesn't exist, but, there is something like protoplasm. Our cells are full of goo, and really that's where all the action is, the proteins, the DNA, all the molecules that scientists discover much later.
I was impressed with the humility that it took for Huxley to basically publish a whoops in Nature. And also it was difficult to imagine a time when Nature would publish a whoop. Never mind.
Yeah, it is definitely to his credit. Yeah, and there were definitely people who would not say "oops." I have some stories about people who really thought that they had grasped the life itself, and turned out to be really wrong and couldn't admit it, and that was their doom. They would be laughed out of science and would be just harbor bitter resentment for decades until their death. So it's a risky business to try to ask what life is.
I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna ask what life is. Your book explored, a bunch of different criteria. You had metabolism, maintaining this internal balance known as homeostasis, reproduction, and evolution. Did you ever come up with kind of a definition or even just a set of criteria that satisfied you?
No. And the more I thought about it, the less satisfied I was. And that doesn't mean that I have some, particular insight beyond the great minds that I'm writing about in this book. But when you see scientists over the centuries coming up with one definition after another, you notice that each definition has an awful lot to do with what that particular scientist is interested in. So when biochemists were first figuring out some of the molecules of life, the enzymes and so on, they define life in terms of biochemistry. Someone like Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA, really thought about life very much from the perspective of genetic information. So, clearly, and yet, like, it's strange because, we all intuitively have a sense that there is something alive, starting with ourselves. And I think that's actually where we get into trouble. Part of the trouble is a sort of a philosophical problem. Maybe we're framing these questions incorrectly, but part of the problem is sort of a psychological one. We have intuitions about life and death, and those are the product of natural selection. Those are survival traits, I would argue. And those are great for genes getting passed on, but they're not necessarily going to give you a super precise guide to what it really does mean to be alive. The irony is that, we feel alive in a way that, like, it's so obvious that surely life must be obvious. But as I write in the book, there's actually a psychological disorder called Cotard syndrome, where people are just as convinced that they are dead, and they will explain to their doctors, how it is that they can be talking to them even though they're dead, and they come up with very elaborate explanations that make sense to them, so. We actually have these sort of, these circuits in our brains that register our own existence, which can become faulty. We are very keenly aware of the lives of others. We sense biological motion and so on. So I think that makes us think that this question should be easy to answer, or that there must be an answer when maybe there isn't.
Yeah, you explored some really wild examples of kind of key aspects of life and just showed the huge variety there is in the world. I remember reading about the slime molds, and you also visited a basement full of snakes. What did you find out as you explored these different forms of life?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that, a good place to sort of center the book would be with these hallmarks of life. The kinds of things that we generally agree are the kinds of things that make life. So metabolism is something. We use this, we use certain molecules to make a fuel called ATP. And it's pretty universal among living things to take in nutrients and energy, and to create this fuel that we can then use to power our own bodies. So I wanted to really get to know it in a very extreme, impressive form. And really, snakes are the best. Pythons are fantastic because, they can eat really big things, half their own weight easily, and break it down and turn it into more snake. And so I went down to Tuscaloosa, the University of Alabama, and hung out with a biologist who studies snakes. And we went to a place where he has basically given snakes that he's done studying to a snake hobbyist who's basically, his whole basement is just full of these gigantic pythons and constrictors, beautiful animals that are very well taken care of. And we just sort of, fed them rats, and the scientists sort of talked to me about what's going on once that rat goes inside. That python actually has to burn an incredible amount of fuel to get fuel out of that food. You have to spend the energy to earn the energy. And he had basically determined that the metabolic rate of a python that's totally motionless, breaking down a rat or a rabbit or something, that's about the same level as a horse in full gallop. Now, a horse in full gallop will stop after a couple minutes. This python can keep that rate up for days. So if you want to sort of see metabolism like at its finest, you go and hang out with a python and watch them feed on things. you mentioned slime molds. Slime molds are an amazing organism that a lot of people just don't even know exists. But if you see some weird kind of strange jelly-like stuff on the forest floor, that's a slime mold. And it's kind of like Bathybius. It's like this mat of protoplasm that's extending little arms out all over the place to feed on bacteria. And I went to a lab where they actually are basically like giving them problems to solve, like, trying to find food like that's hidden behind a wall, or two sources of food on different side of a dish, and one's got a lot of protein, one's got a lot of carbohydrates, or a maze. These slime molds solve these problems. They make decisions about where to go in order to get their food. They don't have a brain. They're sort of pure decision making at its most basic level. And all living things have to do that. You can't, when you're alive, you just can't be random. You have to make some decisions that help you to survive. And so slime mold is, I feel, like the purest example of that kind of intelligence almost.
Mm-hmm. To me, slime molds and snakes, they're definitely alive. Like, there's that just intuition, obviously. And there were some stranger kind of edge cases of near life or possible life that you also explored in this book. So what were some of the strangest ones that you uncovered?
Well, there are some that are kind of familiar to us, like viruses, for example. Viruses, they don't have a metabolism. So some people say, well, they can't be alive. Okay, but here's something that's not alive, but it can evolve, it can replicate, it can do lots of things that we think are really unique to life. When you just pull that metabolism out and it's not alive or kind of alive. But there are actually other examples that also challenge us. So, for example, there are these little animals called tardigrades, sometimes nicknamed water bears. They live in the soil, they live everywhere in the oceans and so on. You can see them under a microscope, adorable little things. And they go about their business as regular animals. And as regular animals, they have bodies that are full of water, and the proteins are in that water doing what proteins do. They can get dried out and survive. They can go into space and survive. And the reason is that they are adapted for basically going into a sort of a third state. Biologists say, like, there's life, there's death, and then there's this third state. And for what happens to these tardigrades is that the water disappears from their body. It's replaced by other chemicals, certain kinds of sugars and certain kinds of proteins that form a glass. So they turn themselves into glass, and they're not metabolizing at all. They can't, because they have no water, which is essential for these to allow proteins to carry out their reactions. So what are they? Are they dead? Well, you pour water on them and they're back in action. You can wait 30 years and pour water on them and they're back in action. So there are lots of these strange examples that, as soon as people come up with a definition of life, you can say, well, yeah, but what about this? And that's what makes life so endlessly fascinating, is that it just keeps slipping away from our easy definitions.
Has the coronavirus changed the conversation at all about whether viruses are alive?
It's a great question. I wrote an essay about this in the New York Times recently, and that's adapted from the book, Life's Edge. And, I think that what the pandemic did was it made people really aware of viruses. Someone like me, I wrote a book called The Planet of Viruses. Like, I have viruses on the mind, but most people don't. You sort of go about your day, you get a cold sometimes, and you don't really think much about it. But viruses have this extraordinary existence, we'll call it. We can argue if they have an extraordinary life, but I think that the coronavirus really just pushed it in everyone's faces. Like, suddenly, everybody was incredibly obsessed with exactly which protein on the surface of our cells that the coronavirus binds to gain entry. People started to know that on their own that coronaviruses use RNA for their genes. They don't use DNA. They are RNA viruses. People became aware that coronaviruses can evolve. That's why we have these variants that we're so stuck with, we're struggling with. And so then that naturally offers the opportunity to say now that you're seeing the coronavirus in action, making countless copies of itself all over the world and bringing human civilization practically to a halt, what is this? Is this alive? And the fact is that, this is a question that is not new to coronaviruses. People have been asking this about viruses basically since they discovered viruses. In the 1930s, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist named Wendell Stanley discovered he could actually turn viruses into crystals like salt or ice, and he could just store them away and then bring them back and pour water on them, a little bit like tardigrades. And they were viruses that could infect cells all over again. Wow. So viruses are a really hard case. I think, the way to think about them is as part of life. If you want to be a stickler about life, that it has metabolism, we can say, okay, well, they are an incredibly important element of the living world.
I guess computer viruses get even weirder, right? Because, they require energy to exist in some form. They reproduce, they change. Are they alive?
So that is a really interesting question to ask scientists, especially if you have a computer scientist and a microbiologist right next to each other, which I've done sometimes. And then you just sort of step back and just let the sparks fly. I don't go into artificial life that much in this book. I have written magazine articles about it, but there are people who study artificial life and create digital organisms, and they very much think that if they're not alive, they capture a lot of what's interesting about life. They can evolve in interesting ways, and you can ask scientific questions about life studying these digital organisms. But there was a scientist named Kate Adamala at the University of Minnesota who I talked to a lot while working on this book. So what Kate is trying to do is trying to build cells from scratch that are alive. So she's made lots of strides towards these protocells, but there's a ways to go. And she and her colleagues, are still working on it. But I said, so Kate, artificial life, is that life? And she's like, no, absolutely not. I mean, just absolutely no pause, brooking no exception. I was like, really? Why is that? And she said, well, I have something I call the GOO rule, the GOO. Goo is in protoplasm. It's like, if it doesn't have goo, it can't be alive. So that's the way Kate sees it. So that question of is artificial life or computer virus alive, that is a live question, forgive the pun. But again, in a really fascinating way. Artificial life has become so sophisticated, in the past 20 years. It's really extraordinary, the kinds of things that people can do with it. You can sort of watch the evolution of parasites and the evolution of sexual reproduction in these digital universes. But I don't think we've settled the question of whether they're really alive.
Does settling that question even matter? I mean, why does defining life matter when is it good enough that we know it when we see it usually?
I don't think so. You could. Life is life. Life is the fact that we are alive gives our lives meaning, right? I feel very fortunate that I have this life for these whatever decades I'm going to be here on this planet. What is that I'm experiencing? I mean, like, when do each of us become alive? When do our lives end? There you have a very important legal question with a lot of differences. The beginning of life as well is a hugely important political issue in the United States. NASA is spending a whole lot of money going to places like Mars, with one of its missions being to see whether there's life there. We have an amazing space probe on Mars with a helicopter on board. I mean, this is incredible stuff. And one of the things that this probe is going to do is look around and see if maybe there are clues to whether or not there was life on Mars. So what do we mean? What are we looking for? I mean, do we have to see people running around to be satisfied that it's life? Would a tardigrade be enough? Or is there some broader definition of life that we need to set up to know what we're going to be dealing with on Mars? Not to mention looking at now we can look at planets and other solar systems through telescopes. What should we be looking for? How would we know life if it's hit us in the face?
I'd be pretty astounded to see a tardigrade on Mars. I remember in your book, you talked to a scientist with the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right? Who had kind of this almost an opposite reaction to a lot of the other scientists in your book, that she actually tries not to let this kind of strict idea of earthbound life constrain her work. Why was that?
Yeah, so this is Lori Barge, and she's at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And, I posed it to her, what kind of definition of life does she have? She would like to send an astrobiological mission to one of these frozen moons of Saturn and Enceladus and see what's underneath there. I've said well, do you have a definition of life that would guide you? And she's like, I don't want to get stuck with that. It's not that important to me to come up with a definition. I want to go there and see if there's anything interesting there. Is there interesting chemistry? And if there is, then maybe we can take a closer look and see exactly what's going on. And maybe that would be something that we might agree on is life. So what Lori does is she builds what you could call chemical gardens in her lab, which are these, basically you mix chemicals together and they form these beautiful, almost castle-like structures in liquid. We make these chemical gardens when we're kids. You buy kits and you do that. So she's doing it as a job, with all sorts of crazy chemicals that mimic what's going on the seafloor on this planet and what might be happening on other planets or other moons where you have a liquid ocean. So these might be the kinds of places where, some scientists think where life began on Earth, and where maybe life could have also separately begun, or maybe it hasn't begun yet. Maybe you get to Enceladus and you find that there are a lot of really big, interesting molecules that have formed there. Some really elaborate chemistry is going on, but maybe it's not quite life. It's maybe come back in a million years and it might have taken off. It was really interesting to actually meet somebody who studies life on other planets, who is actually trying to avoid getting stuck in a definition of life.
Yeah, you mentioned the origins of life on this planet, and it sounds like we know the broad strokes, but there's still, debate about where those very first cell-like blobs of fatty membranes around chemistry actually formed. What do we know, and what are scientists still investigating?
So the origin of life really does, require you to sort of try to define your terms of what began and, what came before it. And, this was something actually Charles Darwin, really tried to avoid. He's like, okay, like I have this theory of evolution, but the origin of life, like I just don't want to go there. It's too much. It's too complicated. We don't know enough about it. And things have changed tremendously since then, in the sense that we know, first of all, we know much more about the sort of the chemical nature of life. And we know a lot more about the fossil record of life. So we've got fossils of microbes going back over 3.5 billion years. And there's a lot of really beautiful research going on, laboratory experiments, looking for sort of plausible pathways. How could you go from the raw material of the Earth, say 4 billion years ago, to living things? That doesn't mean that how life began here is the only way that life can start. But scientists are just trying to get clues. Well, how did it start here? I would focus on one scientist who I've reported on for literally decades now, named David Deamer, he is convinced that life began on volcanic islands in little ponds, a little bit of what Darwin speculated on, but in a much more sophisticated, elaborate thing of RNA forming and started to get sandwiched between oily membranes and then eventually becoming these protocells that Kate Adamala is trying to make. Whereas there are other people who are convinced that the action was all happening at the bottom of the ocean in these chemical gardens. It can't both be right. They can't both be right. They can't. So it's fascinating to see these two models becoming more fleshed out and just more fascinating. And they're discovering more chemistry as they go. I mean, literally, as David Deamer was trying to think about how life could have originated in these volcanic islands, he got an idea about how to get genetic material inside of a protocell. Maybe could they pull them inside and hold on to them? And then it occurred to him like, oh, this would actually be a way to sequence DNA. And that became the seed for what's called nanopore sequencing, which is one of the most important ways of sequencing DNA right now. And it's possible that NASA will actually send a nanopore sequencer to Enceladus to try a probe could fly through one of these plumes of seawater that comes out of these cracks in the moon. And you'd use this nanopore sequencer to see if there's anything like DNA or RNA that's coming out of there. If there's life, maybe it's got genes, and maybe this technology that came from the search for the origin of life here on Earth can help us find it somewhere else. That would be cool. We will see if that happens.
That'd be really cool. So you interviewed scientists that you've known for decades. You visited a snake basement. You went caving to commune with hibernating bats. What was one of the wildest things you encountered or experienced while you were researching this book? I really wanted to report on homeostasis by getting to know bats, because I think bats are just amazing as life forms that can keep their internal state in balance. They can fly through the air and keep themselves stabilized. They can even some bats which feed on flowers can hover in front of flowers. They can keep their temperature stable. They're warm-blooded. And they can even manage this through the winter by doing something amazing, by hibernating. And they shift their bodies to a new state, a new kind of homeostasis type balance. So I went on a trip with some New York State biologists who study hibernating bats, and they go where the bats are. And the bats in New York State, a lot of them go into abandoned mines. They go into, there are these mines that were created for graphite in the 1800s, for pencils. And so the miners just sort of dug away. They put in timbers to prop things up. And then
all the graphite business went off to Madagascar. The whole graphite industry collapsed, and they just left these mines alone. And now they're just home to bats. So we went into this this mine that's just like, not really doing very well. It's just collapsing in on itself. And yet there were these beautiful bats that were spending the winter there, waking up every few weeks to drink a little bit of water and then going back into this strange state of theirs. That was a really wonderful experience, made particularly wonderful by the fact that I was able to get out of that place in one piece. Before we went in, the biologists I was with were saying that just don't touch the ceiling. That's the kind of place we were going into. But yeah, life, it just goes to show, like, life goes everywhere. I mean, any nook and cranny where there's some water and some habitable conditions, you're going to find life. Probably more likely a microbe than a bat, but it's everywhere. And to kind of get to know it in its extremes, in its range of possibilities, you have to go to some extreme places.
Mm-hmm. That had to have been, though, before the pandemic started, right?
Yes. That was actually right before the lockdown. So after that, my research for the book became very much, over the phone, Zoom interviews, walking around in the woods where I live in Connecticut and so on. And also, writing about the coronavirus. Suddenly here was this amazing thing taking over the world and everyone's consciousness. That was the perfect illustration of how hard it is to draw the line between life and non-life. Yeah. Between juggling your reporting on the coronavirus and having to cancel, travel, what wound up getting left on the cutting room floor for this book that you wish you'd been able to include? There were certainly things that I did leave out. And I think artificial life is an example of that, where I just said, that would be great. But you know what? That's just a chapter I'm just not going to write. I think part of that is that, when you write books, books can get very long. And, the last book I wrote, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, is, over 600 pages. So, I decided, it was time to write a book that's, a good reasonable thickness. I wasn't going to try to pretend to have an encyclopedia of all living things, and certainly not an encyclopedia of all ideas and theories about life, of which there are many. But just to sort of give kind of a representative sampling on this journey, as I mentioned, just taking this trip from life as we know it to the edges where we're not really sure what we're dealing with anymore. You did manage to get into the lab, though, before the pandemic started for this book, to look into yourself, how organisms adapt and evolve. So what was that like? You write about science, but, here you are doing it. What did you learn? I learned I probably wouldn't be a great scientist. I don't have that exacting attention to detail that scientists have to have. So another hallmark of life is its capacity to evolve. Everything that we consider alive evolves, and viruses evolve too, even though some people don't think they're alive. So evolution is really like stitched into the nature of life. For Darwin, evolution was something that you saw the tail end of. You saw the products of evolution. You saw the ways in which species were adapted to their environment or to other species. And those are the products of millions and millions of years of adaptation. But now scientists can actually study evolution over the course of weeks or even days, because they can study bacteria. And there's a scientist at the University of Pittsburgh, Vaughn Cooper, who, with his colleagues, realized they could create a kit for high school students to run their own evolution experiments. And I figured, well, if high school kids can do it, then surely I could. And so I went over to Yale, where a scientist named Isabel Ott took pity on me and sort of babysat me over the course of a week while I basically drove the evolution of bacteria. These were bacteria that form sort of slimy coats on surfaces, and so they'd form a slimy coat on a plastic bead in a tube, and I would take that out and I would put it in a centrifuge and spin off the bacteria, and then move them into another tube with beads on it, and we just sort of transfer them. And over the course of a week, you're selecting for bacteria that are better at surviving in this crazy environment you created for them. But every little movement was so challenging. Like, Isabel would just be, for her, like the world is just full of bacteria and fungal spores that could just totally ruin your experiment. And so she's always trying to create sort of the zone of sterility around her experiments. And so, if I brushed a pipette against the counter and didn't even realize it, she'd be like, change out. You got to, that's ruined. It's covered in that. Yeah. So you can see evolution, but you have to be really careful to see it. This might seem like a kind of an abstract exercise, but the fact is that this is actually directly medically important, because this kind of evolution happens with microbes inside our own bodies. They're forming biofilms in our bodies, and for people with cystic fibrosis, a relative of the bacteria I was studying can cause these really terrible infections by forming these slimy biofilms in their lungs. And by studying how they evolve, you can actually come up with strategies to force them to become vulnerable to antibiotics and be unable to make biofilms. Again, like you say, does it really matter, what life is and how life works? And it's like, yeah, it's a matter of life and death if you got cystic fibrosis.
Yeah. So it makes me wonder, looking at all of these different forms of life, if you had to put philosophers and scientists in a ring and have them duke it out over how to define life, how would that go?
It wouldn't be pretty. I mean, so scientists have a way of coming up with definitions for life a lot. There are hundreds of definitions of life that scientists have proposed over the years, and they're still coming up with new ones. And you don't really see a real steady convergence where people say, like, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. Yeah. And we're not getting down to one definition. If you bring philosophers in, then they will start saying, well, what are we doing here? Like, what are we trying to do? What is the goal here? What do we mean by these words that we're using? And so, some philosophers have talked about ideas that people like Wittgenstein promoted, where, it's instead of life, like, let's say we're trying to define games. How do we do that? Would we come up with a list of things that all games have to be considered a game? Well, that would be really hard to do. And because games are similar to each other and different, some games we play for money, some games are for free. Some games involve winning and losing. Some games are completely open-ended, but we consider them all games. And so Wittgenstein said, like, well, they're associated, they're connected. They have what you could call family resemblances. So maybe we should just think about these things that we call living as having these resemblances to each other. So it's not a big deal that viruses don't, have all the things that we have that we think of as being life, but they have a lot, and so they're part of this network of living things, perhaps. But there are other philosophers who are just way more radical than that, and they just say definitions are meaningless. It's like saying to ask an alchemist, define water. They're going to define it according to concepts that are just wrong. They don't even understand that there's a molecular basis to this thing they're calling water. So trying to define it is meaningless. What you need to do is do lots of experiments, get lots of data, and then have a theory click into place. So once you have a theory of chemistry, then water makes a lot more sense, and you can start with thinking, well, what are these things that are atoms of oxygen with hydrogen connected to them, and they do things in interesting ways. So they would argue, well, we need a theory of life, which we don't really have yet. That is a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. We're starting to get some audience questions come in. And the first one is, how do you think humans will approach discovering life on other planets? If we found a worm-like creature on Mars, would we just slice it up without regard for its intelligence?
Wow, if we found a worm on Mars, that would be amazing. I have to say that I am hoping for something like bacteria. Living, right below the surface, maybe in a little damp patch. I think that bacteria are fascinating, and don't get me wrong, but I think it would be a lot to expect to find a worm on Mars. But I think we do, in order to understand something, you want to analyze it, and that means, to some extent, like pulling it apart. So there might very well be a sample return from Mars if we find something that looks like life or a fossil, because scientists are going to want to look at this up close. But we do need to, respect the possibility that there is life either as we know it or as we don't know it on Mars or other places. And be very careful about the probes that we send there. NASA is doing its best to try to make these probes completely sterile, because the last thing you want is to basically seed a planet with bacteria from back on Earth that are going to mask the things that you want to see on another planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that question also really gets at the how nebulous consciousness and intelligence and life all are as concepts, and how difficult it is to kind of tease them apart and understand them individually or together. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, consciousness is very much sort of wrapped up in our concepts of life, and a reader just emailed me and declared that consciousness is life. And I was like, well, okay. I mean, tell it to the slime mold. But the thing is that we are, our existence is very much sort of organized around our brains. And so, some scientists have argued that when we define life, we define it by the integration of chemistry and other processes. And so, in a microbe, that integration takes place just within the cell. Whereas in us, the most important integration happens in our brains, where we're taking information from lots of cells and integrating them into an awareness of our own bodies, of ourselves, of the world around us, our consciousness. So, that, and again, like that feeds into these very important, urgent issues. Like, when do we declare people dead? This idea of integration is why brain death is such a widespread standard for death. It's not that our cells are clicking along and burning ATP. It's like, do we have an integrated existence still? So when you bring up consciousness, I talk about it in the book along these lines.
Yeah, we have another question about, can you talk about the breakthroughs in the human realms, like the double helix that can be applied in the pursuit of social equity, the connection between DNA and the Innocence Project? Thoughts?
Yeah, well, yeah, well, I mean, certainly like science is not somehow severed from its social milieu. Science is a social process. People do it. They do it together. They do it in societies, and what they do has impact on other people, on non-scientists. And so you certainly, when Francis Crick and Rosalind Franklin and James Watson and others figured out the structure of DNA, they didn't have the Innocence Project in mind. This project to show that some prisoners were actually innocent of the crimes they were convicted of. They're after the big questions. They were saying like, we're gonna get to solve the mystery of life, and in so doing, they created these tools, which are incredibly powerful, and can be used in terrible ways and in potentially good ways. So the fact that you can, once you understand how DNA is structured and what its function is in life, then you realize like, I can tell two living things apart by looking at their DNA, even two members of the same species. And if the DNA on that knife doesn't match the DNA, of my client, that person should be able to walk free. There's the potential for unexpected good things, practical things to come out of this fundamental basic question that we're still wrestling with. And I think that's always true of science. And we shouldn't have scientists get too pegged down to trying to answer really specific little questions. Like if you let scientists run wild and deal with these big crazy questions and fail over and over and over again, things like the Innocence Project will come out.
Yeah, we saw that with Diemer's work, exploring, just basic life, and then making this discovery that became fundamental to DNA sequencing now.
That's right. So these nanopore sequencers are because they take care. They sort of mimic what David Diemer imagines is one of like the most primitive basic processes in life. He imagines like a strand of DNA or some other genetic molecule going through a pore. And he realized like, well, as it goes through the pore, there's going to be a little change in sort of the electric charge there that you could measure. And so decades later now, there are these little devices that can do that. And they're really small and they're really cheap. And so they're being deployed like, when there was the big outbreak of Ebola a few years ago in West Africa, people were just sequencing genetic material just like in clinics, just right there and then. They didn't have to ship it off to have fancy machines sequence them. So you're going to see this, this nanopore sequencing more and more in our lives. It's being used actually to sequence coronaviruses too. And that just came out of thinking about, well, what's the minimum of life that I can imagine?
Yeah. So you have been covering scientific advancements for decades, and this audience member wants to know what you are most excited about in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to sort of potentially like start hitting some really interesting, I don't know what you call them, like a phase change in sort of our understanding of a lot of different sciences, including life. I mean, it's really interesting to think about ourselves as being like living at a time before a theory comes together. Imagine that you lived a few decades before the germ theory of disease help you to understand why you get sick. And your doctor is talking about humors and whatnot, and it's none of it really makes sense, and it doesn't. It's very unsatisfying. And then like the germ theory of disease comes along, and it just things start to fall into place. I think that maybe in 10 years, maybe like, some of these theories of life will really come together. And, maybe we'll look at life as like sort of a property of matter, like superconductivity. Superconductivity is very weird. And when scientists first found it, they said, like, what is this substance doing? How is it that this resistance has disappeared from this material? It seemed arbitrary and didn't really fit into what they knew about physics. And great minds like Einstein and Feynman failed to get an answer. But eventually some people came along and did some Nobel Prize winning work, and they offered a theory. And now we kind of understand what has to happen to certain kinds of matter in order for this phenomenon to emerge. So, it would be really exciting to say, like, to be able to say, like, well, life doesn't necessarily have to be made of DNA. Life emerges when matter fulfills, certain things. I'm pretty optimistic that as scientists are measuring life in incredibly fine detail, that a theory, a really strong theory, is going to emerge.
I think we have time for 2 more questions in the next 4 minutes. See if we can do it. This one is also about life on other planets. So how do your own ideals and personal value systems influence what you instinctively think of as life on other planets? And how do you detach from that to be objectively imaginative?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can't help but think about life on other planets as you see it around us. So I look out my window and I see trees. So, you imagine that, a planet with life on it would have giant plants. But it doesn't have to be the case. I mean, plants weren't, for most of the history of life on Earth, there weren't plants. So, I try my best to sort of to think about life on Earth as widely as I can. There are microbes that live in the rock under the seafloor that are feeding on the radioactive breakdown of elements in there. That doesn't feel like life as we know it, but it's right here on Earth. So in trying to sort of like push out my own sort of mental models of life here on Earth, I think that's useful for trying to think about what life might be like on other planets. We can be biased and say like, oh, it's going to have to be carbon. Maybe that's true. Maybe carbon's the only atom that really has, or the only element that really has what it takes to produce these genetic type molecules. Maybe silicon would work too. We have to go and find out.
So what's the next book?
Yeah, right. After a book about life, what happens next? Honestly, like I have no idea. At the moment, I've sort of, my editors at the New York Times have allowed me to step away from intense daily coverage of the pandemic about vaccines and variants and all the rest of the science of the pandemic, just to focus on talking about the book for a while. I'm hoping when I go back that, my services, writing about the pandemic won't have to be put into use quite so much. I think these vaccines are really going to help us to drive down this pandemic finally. So when the dust settles, I think I will stop and think like, what's next? I don't have an answer yet for that, but I'm sure something will come.
Were there any stories from researching this book that you really just wanted to dive into or tease out even more? Yeah, there are people who are basically having robots run chemical experiments 24 hours a day to see if chemistry can come to life. I'd love to see that in person and see how that's going. So it's going to be great to be able to actually go and visit science in their habitat, in their labs, in their caves, wherever science is happening. So that I'm really looking forward to that after I'm vaccinated and the rest of us are vaccinated. Yeah, got some reporting trips planned.
Yeah, whenever I'm not buying the tickets yet, but they're planned up here.
Mm-hmm. Well, our thanks to Carl Zimmer, columnist for the New York Times and author of Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. And we encourage you to pick up your copy of Carl's new book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club efforts, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. And I also have to slip in there that CalMatters also values the support of its readers. And if you've enjoyed this program, please do visit our website, calmatters.org, for more information about how to support our nonprofit newsroom. I'm Rachel Becker. Thank you and goodbye.